You can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. To hear the latest episode, just say, "Play the news from The Australian."
From The Australian, here's What's on the Front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Tuesday, July 30. Aerial patrols of Australia's northern coastline have slumped, with Operation Sovereign Borders cutting back flights by 20% each year, even as boat arrivals increase. It's the first challenge for new Immigration and Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke. The militant construction union CFMEU could be in administration for years. That's according to new Workplace Relations Minister Murray Watt in an exclusive interview live now at theaustralian.com.au. John Peros, the man acquitted of murdering Shandee Blackburn, is suing Shandee's sister, journalist Hedley Thomas, and the publishers of The Australian over our podcast Shandee's Story. In today's episode, why John Peros says the episode caused him serious harm, and what the publishers say in reply. Before we start, this episode contains some adult language.
100% matter of fact, it was him.
That's Shandee Blackburn, the sister of Shandee Blackburn, who in 2013, at the age of 23, was murdered in a stabbing frenzy by someone who is still at large. John Peros, the man you heard Shandee accusing, has always denied killing Shandee, his ex-girlfriend. Those words, spoken by Shandee in episode 13 of The Australian's investigative podcast Shandee's Story, are now the subject of a defamation case. John Peros is suing Nationwide News, the company that publishes The Australian, and Shandee herself, as well as our national chief correspondent Hedley Thomas, who reported and hosted Shandee's Story. We've used voice actors throughout this episode to bring you the words spoken in the Queensland Supreme Court on Monday. These are the words of Barrister David Helvaghian, acting for Peros.
Episode 13 publishes one of the most serious defamatory imputations known to society.
This hearing is not the defamation trial. It's a pre-trial hearing to determine whether or not John Peros was caused serious harm by the publication of episode 13 of Shandee's Story, released in December 2021. Shandee was violently murdered on February 9, 2013, as she walked home from work after midnight. The killer stabbed Shandee dozens of times, leaving her to die in a gutter. If you've listened to Shandee's story, you'll remember this harrowing audio of the person who discovered her body on a Mackay Street, calling 000.
Is she awake?
No.
Is she breathing, sir?
She don't look like she's breathing at all, man.
Sir, confirm to me, is she breathing?
No, she ain't breathing at all.
Is there a defibrillator available?
No, not at all, not at all.
Sir, what is your name? What is your name?
In 2014, Shandee's ex-boyfriend John Peros, a talented local boxer and diesel fitter, was charged with Shandee's murder. He was found not guilty.
When a jury found John Peros not guilty of Shandee Blackburn's murder in 2017, it left her family and the Mackay community with even more questions. He was accused of stabbing Shandee Blackburn more than 20 times on her way home from work in 2013.
That verdict meant Peros was free to get on with his life. But in 2019, a coroner conducted an inquest into Shandee's death. The coroner, David O'Donnell, compelled John Peros to give evidence after Peros initially refused on the ground that the evidence would tend to incriminate him. There's a rule in coronial proceedings that evidence given under compulsion in an inquest cannot be used in other proceedings. On 21 August 2020, the coroner found Peros had, in fact, killed Shandee with a bladed instrument. The coroner also said he believed the evidence of certain witnesses about John Peros, including that Peros had said to friends phrases like this about Shandee.
I fucking hate that cunt.
And something like,
She would be better off dead. I hate her and I would love to stab the cunt.
We've used a voice actor to bring you those words from the coroner's findings. The coroner also found that a white ute seen on CCTV near the scene of Shandee's death at approximately the time of her death was in fact John Peros's car. Peros said he couldn't remember whether he had driven on that street at that time or not. But even though the coroner found John did kill Shandee, he was not charged again because Peros had already been acquitted. The legal principle of double jeopardy means you can't be tried for the same offence twice. There are exceptions, including when fresh and compelling evidence that wasn't presented in the first trial becomes available. But Peros has not been charged again. He's got on with his life, including working in the mining industry in WA. In December 2022, he was found guilty of an assault at a BHP mine site. Peros was fined $2,000 and granted a spent conviction. Here's how the West Australian reported it at the time.
John Peros claimed at trial he was acting in self-defence when he laid into Alexander Gell. The 40-year-old fly-in, fly-out worker beat and kicked Mr Gell so badly it left him with significant facial injuries and the loss of a tooth.
In court on Monday, John Peros's lawyer argued his reputation was caused serious harm by episode 13 of Shandee's story.
As Your Honour knows, the crime of murder in this state carries a life sentence. It is probably society's greatest crime. To label someone the murderer of another person is just of the highest seriousness. However, to do so as part of an investigative true crime publication from a mainstream media company and from a journalist with a credible history in these matters is even more serious.
So Helvadjian is saying that if this had been published elsewhere, it might not have caused the same level of harm.
Your Honour would know The Australian as a mass media publication of serious repute. It's not a tabloid or a Daily Rag type publication.
I've got to jump in here to defend tabloids, by the way. The shape of a newspaper doesn't determine its quality, and there's plenty of outstanding journalists and great journalism in tabloid papers. Anyway, back to David Helvadjian.
Secondly, you ought to be aware of the name Hedley Thomas and that he is a journalist who not only led the Shandee Story podcast, but he's also the second defendant.
At this point, the judge weighed in. This is a voice actor reading Justice Peter Applegarth's words.
I made a disclosure before hearing back in April that I met Mr Thomas professionally many years ago, but I haven't seen him in person or spoken to him for 16 years.
In that time period, he has become a brand name in true crime podcasts.
He'll forgive me if I haven't listened to his podcasts.
As of today, approximately 380,000 people across Australia have heard the imputation. Episode 13 had a far greater reach across Australia than the reporting of the coroner's finding.
And this is where the real case begins. Helvadjian, on behalf of Peros, says even though the coroner in 2020 found John Peros killed Shandee Blackburn, his reputation was largely unharmed until Hedley Thomas and Shandee's story came along in 2021.
The other inference, clearly, is a podcast such as this would not have approximately 380,000 downloads in Australia if it wasn't credible. So just the fact it's a highly popular and shared and considered podcast is the circumstance of publication.
I'm not sure if circulation means something's credible. In America, at least, you have these lunar people who have all kinds of conspiracy theories.
Yes, that's a very good point.
Coming up after the break, what lawyers for The Australian are arguing. As you just heard David Helvadjian say, we're a mass media publication of serious repute. He's a subscriber, you should be too. Join us for just $1 a week for the first 4 weeks at theaustralian.com.au. We'll be back after this break.
Just listen to this. Her ex absolutely did it.
That's a Reddit user with the handle BardGirl23 commenting in early 2022, shortly after the public release of episode 13 of the Australians podcast Shandee's Story. Someone called Blonde Arbuckle agrees.
100% he did.
And another Reddit user, Nora Ladora, says,
I'm listening now and I feel it's so clear that it was the ex. The crime was so personal and John was abusive to Shandee. It's crazy that he was acquitted.
These posts are part of the evidence from John Peros's lawyers in his claim that the Australians podcast caused serious harm to his reputation. You've already heard Peros's arguments. This is what the lawyers for the other side say.
A coroner made a finding that Miss Blackburn died as a result of a violent assault where she was stabbed multiple times after being ambushed in the street. The coroner found that the plaintiff in these proceedings was responsible for her death. That is a fact that cannot be ignored.
Those are the words of Dawud Sibtain SC. Sibtain is a silk engaged to defend Nationwide News, Hedley Thomas and Shandee Blackburn in the defamation action brought by Peros. In defamation cases, it's up to the plaintiff to prove that they suffered serious reputational damage by the publication they're complaining about. And if the material was published to a large number of people, say hundreds of thousands, courts in the past have inferred that the reputational harm must be serious. The Australians' lawyers are challenging this rule. They're saying the plaintiff doesn't necessarily come to court with a good reputation, and it's up to the plaintiff, in this case John Peros, to prove that the publication, in this case episode 13, seriously damaged the reputation they had. We've used a voice actor to bring you Dawud Sibtain's words.
What is required is for this court to undertake a determination as to what was the plaintiff's pre-episode 13 reputation and his post-episode 13 reputation, and then having done that to determine whether or not the harm occasioned to his reputation was caused by the publication concerned.
Often in defamation cases, someone comes before the court to say they know the plaintiff, the person who's suing, and were shocked when they encountered the allegedly defamatory publication. They'll usually say the publication made them think less of the plaintiff and wonder whether they really had done something wrong. In this hearing, Justice Peter Applegarth wondered aloud whether he would be presented evidence from anyone along those lines. A person, not a Reddit user like Nora Ladora or BardGirl23, who says they considered Peros a good person before hearing episode 13 and considered him a murderer afterwards.
I'm trying to grapple with what the plaintiff says was the harm to his reputation. Because traditionally we've had plaintiffs who come along and they say, I was well regarded in my community, and then after the Courier Mail published that article, people treated me funnily in the street, and invitations dried up, and I lost my job. And I was walking down the street and someone yelled out, "You crook!"
I can assure Your Honour there is none of that, not one word. What there is, first, losing his job. He lost his job around the time of episode 1. There isn't a single person on a hearsay basis or otherwise who has said, I heard episode 13 and this is what I thought of him. It's somewhat curious the plaintiff is not giving evidence on this, but the evidence, what there is, the scant evidence, requires such a tortured and fanciful approach to inferential reasoning that Your Honour could not conclude that he suffered serious harm.
Peros's counsel, David Helvadjian, said he did tell the defence lawyers they would not be putting on any more evidence. But, in fact, if the matter proceeds to trial, his side would potentially be adding more evidence of damage to Peros's reputation. And Helvadjian said regardless, the Reddit posts were evidence of episode 13 helping people make up their minds that John Peros was a killer.
That evidence is rebuttal evidence to the idea that there's a settled view in the community that he is a violent killer, because otherwise, why else would they feel the need to post and share? The Reddit comments show it was episode 13 that caused the harm.
Thanks for joining us on The Front. You can keep up with this story, listen to Shandee's story yourself, and read all our outstanding journalism right now at theaustralian.com.au.